You've been lied to about catapults. They weren't toys. They were executioners that turned men into mist. Walls didn't just fall. Bodies did. Bones shattered, and organs were liquefied. These machines of mass terror weren't just designed to breach walls, but to break the human soul. This was precision-engineered slaughter, and it began, officially, in 399 BCE, in a city that was technically Greece, but now sits at the foot of Italy's boot, Syracuse, on the island of Sicily. And the Greeks weren't just building temples, they built the most brutal siege weapon in history. Their spark, a man named Dionysius I, tyrant of Syracuse, part warlord, part psychopath, and full-time arms race enthusiast. Carthage was breathing down his neck. The modern-day Tunisia, and Dionysius didn't like breathing. So he ordered a team of engineers to build the world's first documented torsion-powered catapult. Not a slingshot, a war machine. Torsion coils made of twisted sinew, soaked in grease and stretched until they sang. A throwing arm, carved from ashwood, that could fling death faster than sound. And standardized ammunition, bolts, darts, and melon-sized stones. Only these melons weighed 50 to 80 pounds and could crush a man's chest like a tin bowl. Remember to subscribe. You don't want to miss this. Fun historical aside, the earliest mention of stone-throwing war machines goes back even further, 7th century BCE. King Uzziah of Judah, according to the Book of Chronicles, installed devices in Jerusalem to hurl stones from the city walls. But Dionysius's engineers weren't building wall mounts. They were building mobile murder machines. Now, imagine being one of them. You've spent 6 months perfecting this design, fine-tuning torque ratios from ancient treatises, balancing arm lengths, testing flight angles. And then, one morning, your commander brings in a prisoner. Stripped, bound, blindfolded. You brace the catapult. You load the stone. You tighten the sinew till it groans. The engineer pulls the trigger. The arm snaps with a tendon-popping crack. The stone vanishes, then reappears in a red mist. Just bone, cloth, and a smear across the test wall. The engineer vomits right there in the sand. But Dionysius? He smiled, because he didn't need the engineers to enjoy it. He just needed the weapon to work. And it did. Better than anyone predicted. By the time Philo of Byzantium and Hero of Alexandria came around, the catapult was a discipline, a science. They wrote treatises on velocity ratios and arm geometry. They calculated wind resistance, torsion fatigue, and optimal sinew drying temperatures. This wasn't warfare. It was mechanical theology. And when the first real sieges came, the results were biblical. By 340 BCE, Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, laid siege to the fortified city of Perinthus, what is now known as Turkey. He didn't come with battering rams. He came with catapults. Bolt throwers and stone flingers mounted in rows, designed not just to smash towers but to turn entire neighborhoods into burial pits. According to Diodorus Siculus, the city suffered extraordinary devastation, with over 1,500 civilians and soldiers crushed or shredded before Philip even breached the outer defenses. No negotiations, no mercy, just cold, calculated stone fall. Stones crashed into watchtowers like angry meteorites. Greek historian Aelianus Tacticus later wrote that catapult fire caused entire units to scatter before a single soldier was hit. They called it invisible thunder because by the time you heard it, it was too late. You were already pulp. And yet, the Greeks, for all their geometry and gore, still used the catapult like a scalpel to crack fortresses and to send messages. But then Rome watched, and Rome asked a very different question. What if we never turned it off? What if we didn't just breach walls, but erased cities? The Greeks built it. The Romans saw what it could do and asked, what if it never stopped? That's how we get the onager, the Roman Empire's favorite blunt force sermon. Named after the wild donkey for its violent, unpredictable kick, the onager was more than a machine. It was an unhinged animal, caged in timber, powered by tension, spit, and the vague hope that it didn't explode in your face. Its torsion ropes weren't just pulled tight, they were twisted sinew and scorched horsehair, soaked in oil and smoke, creaking with rage every time it was cocked. One soldier described the sound as a scream from the underworld. That wasn't metaphor. That was Tuesday. Instead of the precision of a ballista, the onager launched stones the size of a soldier's chest, over 270 pounds, depending on the mood of the gods or the sadism of your commander. Each shot took a crew of at least 8. It cracked ribs if you stood too close. It shattered walls, shields, and any idea that the gods still loved you. Field-built in mobile workshops, they could be hauled on oxen carts, then assembled with local lumber and recycled bronze. Roman tactician Vegetius bragged in De Re Militari that every fortification needed its own team of artillerymen, and every siege column carried these angry donkeys in tow. Now let's see what that looked like in blood. Adrianople, 378 CE. The Goths had had enough. Pushed out of their homelands by Huns, forced into Roman territory, starved, cheated, and brutalized. Eventually, they snapped. The Roman Emperor Valens marched out to teach them a lesson. What he got was an apocalypse. Valens refused to wait for reinforcements. Overconfident, he marched his legions into Gothic territory and found their wagons circled in defensive formation. A temporary camp, or so he thought. While his infantry deployed, the Goth cavalry returned, and Adrianople became a meat grinder, the modern-day Aedean in Turkey. It didn't end well. Roman walls, catapults, and field artillery were used defensively as a last resort. The onagers fired blindly over the ramparts, into swirling dust and smoke. Ammianus Marcellinus wrote, "Though none were struck, the very expectation of impact broke their line. The fear of being obliterated by a tumbling boulder was enough to make seasoned warriors turn and run. Some didn't run fast enough. Eyewitnesses described bodies flattened like leather skins, legs twisted backward, torsos half gone. One scribe claimed he saw a man folded like parchment. Whether poetic or literal, the message was clear. Rome had brought thunder. But thunder doesn't always win. By nightfall, 2/3 of the Roman army was dead. Emperor Valens disappeared in the chaos. Some say he burned alive in a farmhouse surrounded by Goths. Others say he was catapulted into irrelevance. Now, let's rewind. Because Adrianople wasn't the first time Rome used catapults to open the gates of hell. For that, we have to go back to Carthage, 146 BCE. This was the end of the Third Punic War. The Romans had laid siege for 3 long years. Starvation set in. Carthaginian defenders drank boiled leather broth. And the catapults? They didn't stop. Day after day, Roman engineers launched stone after stone into the starving city. Appian records the screams of women crushed in collapsing houses, children vaporized by falling masonry, defenders mangled on the walls before they even drew their bows. These weren't random shots. They were mapped, methodical, and endless. By the time the Romans breached the walls and began their massacre, they weren't entering a city. They were entering a graveyard. The death toll? Somewhere between 450,000 and 750,000. Not all from catapults, sure, but they made the gates crack. They made the mines break. They made victory inevitable. And here's the part that never gets printed in your schoolbook's Rise of Rome chapter. The onager wasn't just a siege tool. It was a weapon of morale collapse, of demoralization, of mind games. Roman commanders didn't just fire stones, they fired terror. They aimed for homes, temples, bakeries. Every crash was a sermon. Surrender, or we'll keep preaching. Some cities surrendered after a single day of bombardment. Others held out, only to be erased. Because by now, the Romans had figured it out. If stone could kill, what else could it carry? Stick around, because next, we're going beyond rocks, into fire, disease, rot. The next time a catapult fired, it wasn't just aiming for your walls, it was aiming for your lungs and your soul. Rocks shatter walls. But what if the goal wasn't to break your gate? What if the goal was to break your faith? Welcome to the next chapter in Siegecraft, the age of fire and rot. And God help us all, biology, because once the Romans learned they could hurl a boulder into a bakery, it didn't take long before someone asked, what if we lit it on fire first? They weren't subtle. By the 1st century, Roman and Byzantine engineers were packing ceramic pots with pitch, sulfur, quicklime, and even Greek fire, a sticky, infernal substance that kept burning underwater. Some designs added oil-soaked rags and clay shards to maximize shrapnel. When the pots burst against stone, the effect was biblical. Screaming defenders doused in fire, blinded by lime, skin melting like wax dolls. And this wasn't improvised chaos. Strategicon, the Byzantine field manual, contains detailed instructions on mixing fire jars to maximize range and devastation. Procopius of Caesarea wrote that flaming missiles caused defenders to leap from the walls lest they burn in place. Some did. But wait, you think that's disturbing? Let's dig deeper into the grave. Because when fire got old, they started using corpses. Rotting meat, diseased flesh, infested animals stuffed with hay and filth, launched into city markets, wells, and temples. The goal? Disease, panic, psychological annihilation. The Scythians pioneered it. The Romans copied it. The Mongols perfected it. Kaffa, 1346. Now, a town in Crimea. Ground zero for one very dark chapter. The Mongol army surrounds the Crimean port. Plague rips through their camp. Instead of retreating, they get creative. They catapult infected corpses over the walls. Eyewitnesses describe the air thick with decay. Rats fed on the flesh. Within days, the Genoese inside began to sicken. Some historians believe this was the gateway. This was how the Black Death entered Europe. Not with rats on ships, but with bloated bodies lobbed over stone. Yes, you heard that right. Your high school teachers skipped the part where catapults helped trigger the deadliest pandemic in human history. And it wasn't an accident. It was a military tactic. Biological warfare, centuries before anyone called it that. Picture it. You're a defender on the wall. You see the arc of a stone. You brace. But it's not stone. It's meat. It hits the plaza, bursts. A leg rolls toward a fountain. You want to vomit. You want to scream. You don't want to fight anymore. That was the point. Even cities that survived the siege often collapsed from plague weeks later. Corpses weren't just weapons. They were messages. This isn't just a war for territory. This is a war for your lineage. So what happens when even that doesn't work? What happens when fire and disease fail to crack the soul? Simple. You break the mind. One stone at a time. And that's what we're heading into next. The phase of siegecraft no one wants to talk about. Where the catapult becomes a soundtrack. Where every sunrise brings another chorus of shrieking sky. Next, the thunder that never stops. It started before dawn. A groan of tension. Then the whip crack of release. Then silence. Then screaming. Not from men, but from the sky itself. That's what catapult barrages became in the late centuries. Rituals of torment. The sound alone could drive defenders to madness. Constantinople, 674 CE. Arab forces laid siege to the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Not for a week, not a month, for 4 years. Stone after stone, year after year. Sometimes 300-pound payloads. Sometimes flaming munitions. Always the same rhythm. The Byzantines started calling it the Screaming Sky. They reported wind changes before impact. Soldiers swore they could hear a low moan in the air, seconds before the crash. One account describes a man who clawed at his ears until they bled. Another describes a priest begging the wind to stop, not the enemy. And still, the barrage came, day after day after day. Sound unbelievable? Not if you understand what catapults had become. By this point, Roman and Arab siegecraft had perfected terror engineering. Barrages weren't just physical assaults, they were psychological sieges. The stones didn't always kill. They didn't need to. A single missed shot could break a company's nerve. Ammianus Marcellinus noted that, though no men slain, all rooted by terror itself. Picture it. You're a conscripted farmer on a tower. You haven't slept. The night was filled with sobs and wood, groaning under tension. Then silence. Then a hiss. Then a thud 10 feet from your skull. Dust. Screams. Your friend is missing an arm. You don't wait for orders. You run. That was the point. And here's where it gets truly interesting. Do you think Roman generals just wanted to win sieges? Or did they want to crush cities before the gates even opened? There are records of cities surrendering before the first stone was thrown, just from the sight of the engines being built. Barbarian warbands, famously fearless in close quarters, broke ranks at the sound of rope winding. Even trained soldiers started hallucinating. Prayers turned into babble. Mass desertions. Reported visions of saints and demons above the walls. Terror was a tactic, and catapults were the sermon. But it wasn't just the enemy who was suffering. The engineers broke too. Manuals from the Byzantine era mention crew rotation, not for fatigue, but for sanity. Men started talking to the ropes. Some kissed the frame before release. Others muttered blessings, not curses. One letter, recovered from a Syrian monastery, reads, "We launched 70 stones. The last one, I swear, screamed back. Whether he heard something or simply broke, no one knows. And still, the world kept turning. Now, let's jump to the end. 1453. The fall of Constantinople. The final defense. By then, Ottoman cannons were rewriting warfare. The Islamic superpower of the time, slowly consuming the last pieces of Byzantium. But the Byzantines? They still used catapults. On the inner walls. Because some terrors die hard. Ancient machines rebuilt from monastic blueprints. Bones creaking with age, but still hungry. Venetian observer Niccolò Barbaro wrote of stones hurled with courage, if not power. One final volley. They launched rocks, not to kill, but to remind the enemy what once ruled this land. And for a while, it worked. Byzantine catapults and cannon fire overlapped in such chaos that the Ottoman sappers slowed their advance. Some were crushed, others lost nerve. Not many, but enough. Enough to remind the world. This ancient beast, born in Greek labs and Roman bloodlust, still had bite. But it wasn't dying. It was just getting an upgrade. Because the next generation of engineers, they didn't stop at fear. They asked, what if we made it bigger? What if we made it smarter? What if we made it hungry enough to eat cities whole? And guess what? They did. You think a flying stone was bad? Wait until the machine starts thinking bigger. Because catapults didn't retire with dignity. they metastasized. And when they came back, they brought friends. Enter the trebuchet, the catapult's oversized, overachieving cousin. By the 12th century, torsion machines were old news. Now you had counterweight trebuchets flinging 300-pound loads with the grace of a ballerina and the brutality of a brick to the skull. More range, more accuracy, less recoil, and somehow more personality. At the Siege of Acre, a coastal city in Israel, Richard the Lionheart deployed massive trebuchets with charming names like Bad Neighbor and God's Hammer in 1191. They hurled boulders and blazing pitch at Saladin's forces like it was open mic night at the apocalypse. Over 50,000 were killed in the siege, and those who survived the projectiles often didn't survive what came after: mass executions of prisoners. The machines didn't just open the gates, they signed your death warrant. Fast forward to the Siege of Rhodes, 1480. The Ottoman Empire stormed the island, bringing siege cannons and catapults. Yes, they still used them. Why? Because they worked. Ottoman engineers pounded the Knights Hospitaller with overlapping barrages. The goal wasn't just structural damage, it was sensory annihilation. The clang of impact, the shriek of splinters, the prayers that turned to screams. Estimates vary, but thousands died in the final week alone. And the Knights, they recorded it, not in battle songs, but in burial rosters. One monk wrote, "They fell before the walls not in glory, but in chunks." The Renaissance hadn't made these machines irrelevant. It just made them retro. And the catapult had one final trick up its twisted sleeve. Even after the gunpowder revolution, its ghost lingered. Cannons were faster, yes, but catapults were familiar. They didn't explode in your face. They could be built from scratch in a monastery basement. And sometimes, they were. During the siege of Constantinople in 1453, while Ottoman bombards shattered the outer defenses, Byzantines on the inner walls fired old-style catapults. They rebuilt them from diagrams hidden in cloistered libraries, like archaeologists resurrecting a monster. You can almost hear the whisper, "Just one more shot." Because the truth is, the catapult never really died. Its bones are buried across Masada in Israel, Orléans in France, and Tarsus in Turkey. You can dig up shattered stones the size of bowling balls and still smell the sulfur. Archaeologists call them projectile remnants. The earth calls them trauma. And you know what? We didn't kill it. We just upgraded it. From torsion to counterweight, from stone to steel, from siege weapon to missile system, from breaking walls to breaking psyches. Trebuchets became cannons. Cannons became tanks. Tanks became drones. But it's the same idea, isn't it? Precision from a distance, punishment without warning, silence, then thunder. Now it comes with a joystick and a Geneva Convention clause. But the philosophy hasn't changed. You don't need to conquer a city if you can make them tear it down themselves. They don't list catapults on the world's deadliest weapons, but maybe they should. Not for elegance, not for speed, but for what they left behind. Carthage, Jerusalem, Constantinople, Rhodes, Acre, each reduced to rubble, each echoing with screams. And behind every collapsed wall, every broken gate, was a weapon that didn't bleed, didn't pause, didn't even creak when it killed. Just a crack of twisted sinew, a whistle of air, and then a man was gone. Over 200,000 dead, conservatively. That's not counting the ones crushed slowly, not counting the ones driven mad, just stone and leverage, and enough grease-soaked muscle to end a civilization. Because the catapult wasn't a relic, it was a philosophy. Build terror, launch it, make them beg before they burn. And if you think that story stayed in the past, Look around. From trebuchets to tanks, all we ever did was change the shape of the stone. If you want more history they buried under rubble and screams, subscribe now. And click the video on the screen if you want to know why the Vatican buried a royal autopsy.